pleasure for me to present, I think, a pretty dramatic story about Kentville and the Annapolis Valley's role in the Halifax Explosion 107 years ago. So I will be focusing on a very traumatic and dramatic train ride that was began in Kentville just before noon on December the 6th, 1917, and that ended in Halifax, devastated Halifax, because it had just been blighted by the Halifax Explosion. So I'll be focusing on that train ride, people involved, what happened. It's really pretty amazing stories. Also be sharing some insights about the response to the explosion generally. At the end of the talk, I welcome your questions. I always love sharing information. And some of you may know some things about this train ride and Kentville's response that I don't know about. It's a subject that has not been well looked at, and sadly many of the original records were lost when the Kentville station was destroyed. So it's a subject that in many ways lives on in oral history, and a few period documents that I'll reference. So there's details about who was on that train that are kind of still being established, so I'd love to learn more about this. I'll be drawing on research I did back in 1994 when I was at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. I wrote an article about this train voyage, so I kind of dusted off that research. Yeah, so that's our my focus tonight is sort of the valley to the rescue, the role of a relief train that was sent from Kentville on the very day of the Halifax explosion, and that's where we'll be going tonight. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. And most people can see the pictures all right, I hope. I wish we had a bigger screen, but this is what we could get for tonight. So fortunately, most of my pictures are quite large, so we'll see how we do. And I got a laser pointer to point out details. Okay, I'm sure you all know the basics of the Halifax explosion story, so I'm not going to go minute by minute to the two ships. Suffice to say that the morning of December the 6th, an incoming ammunition-filled French ship, the Mont Blanc, had a collision with an outgoing Norwegian ship called the Emo in the narrows of Halifax Harbor. The two ships collided just before 9 and drifted in the harbor. The Mont Blanc was packed stem to stern with ammunition, and the sparks from the collision ignited a slow fire that then grew bigger and bigger for 20 minutes until the hull of Mont Blanc was sort of heated to the point where the entire cargo exploded. The ship disintegrated into hundreds of thousands of fragments where it had run aground just beside a wharf in the north end of Halifax and leveled the north end of Halifax and killed almost 2,000 people. The largest man-made explosion prior to the atomic era. So it was this awful wartime accident caused by rushed harbor movements supporting the wars in the trenches in Europe. That's the basic for the explosion that I think many of you will know. There's actually a surprising number of pictures of the blast cloud from the Halifax explosion taken miles away by people who had cameras handy. This one was taken by a French sailor aboard one of the ships that was anchored at a safe distance in Bedford Basin, and you see that huge column of smoke from the explosion heading into the sky. And this is what it did to the north end of Halifax and Richmond, and it was like a Hiroshima level of destruction in the areas about 2 kilometers from ground zero. Mont Blanc blew up just at this stub here, which was Pier 6, and so you can see all these buildings close to it were just leveled. This area here, just where you can see the tracks curving a bit, was Richmond Yard, and that's where the heroic telegraph railway dispatcher Vincent Conlin was working. So this is another picture in the Richmond area, and again you can see this was once a busy neighborhood of factories, houses, stores, built all the way up to the top of Fort Needham, and it was just leveled by the force of the blast, then burned by fires that spread from overturned stoves. And in these buildings, the foreground were also hammered by a tidal wave from all the water that the explosion threw up. And this boxcar you can see had just been eviscerated by the force of the blast. When the Intercolonial Railway totaled up the amount of equipment they lost, there were 16 boxcars they couldn't find any trace of. They'd either been vaporized or blown to bits and thrown into the harbor, so powerful was the blast. So it's an enormous explosion, which then caused these fires that were engulfing people trapped in the buildings, and killed almost 2,000 people, rendered 10,000 people homeless in an instant, and created a then real crisis of badly injured people at risk of bleeding to death or dying from trauma that the city had to cope with. So this kind of map from an old DAR timetable of the 1911 kind of situates ourselves a bit. So here's Halifax, world-class city, or world-class harbor, center of big, busy wartime shipping, one of the busiest harbors in the world in 1917. It was the place where all the ships from parts of Northern America would gather in Halifax and then cross the Atlantic with their naval escorts, running the gauntlet of German U-boats. So Halifax was really critical, but so was the Dominion Atlantic Railway, which fed it. The Dominion Atlantic Railway was a regional railway, really important one in 1917. Its tracks ran from Halifax to Yarmouth with multiple branch lines. It was a real enterprise, and it owned its own steamship lines, its own chain of hotels, and an amazing schedule of trains. The day of the explosion, there were 8 different trains scheduled to go to Halifax. It was a really busy line, and those are just the passenger trains. Headquartered was in Kentville, where I think at this point it was estimated that 2/3 of the population in Kentville either worked at the DAR or their family worked at the DAR. And Kentville was really a railway powerhouse for Western Nova Scotia, and had its own shops, its own roundhouse. Operations were based here. It was owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway, but it had a very independent operation. And the general manager of the DAR was a man with enormous power and influence, as we shall see. So I'll be referring to some of these place names. You probably all know. You know where Kentville is. You know where Wolfville is. Here's Windsor. Here's a place called Windsor Junction, just outside of Halifax, and then here's Halifax. So this is the train ride that I'll be talking about along the main line of the DAR, paralleling that long drive along the 101 highway that we all do so regularly to Halifax. So this is a map of Halifax to sort of identify where some of the key players in this drama were in Halifax the moment the explosion occurred. So this nasty little burst here is where Mont Blanc blew up at ground zero at the foot of Richmond Street in Halifax near Pier 6. Right just across the tracks from the wharf was Vincent Conlin, the railway dispatcher. It was his job to control the movement of trains into Halifax. So he was working in a sort of a working train station surrounded by the Richmond railway yards. And as many of you will know, if only from the Heritage Minute, he received last-minute warning that ship on fire that everybody's watching was actually full of ammunition. And he stayed at his post to warn incoming trains, and he was really worried about incoming trains because train number 10, the overnight train from St. John's, according to its schedule, it was supposed to pass within about 200 feet of this burning ammunition ship in about 5 minutes. And he was really worried about this train full of overnight passengers coming in from St. John, plus the DAR train that was following along not far behind, coming the morning train coming in from Kentville. And he wanted to stop those trains, so he stuck at his post to warn them. Not far from where he was a George Graham, the general manager of the Dominion Atlantic Railway. He was in Halifax from Kentville on business, and traveling in his private railway car, as railway general managers did, and it was parked actually quite close to ground zero, just at one end of the Richmond railway yards. Then Fairview Station is a location I'm going to talk quite a bit about, because when the explosion occurred, the train tracks were buried in rubble as far as Vincent Colman Station, and the telegraph lines were all demolished until Fairview Station. So Fairview Station became Halifax's connection with the entire outside world after the explosion, and plays quite an important role in this discussion. So yeah, those are some of the key players. 2 inbound trains at the moment of the explosion, the morning train from Kentville and the overnight train from St. John's. 2 earlier commuter trains had already pulled into North Street Station when the explosion occurred at 9:05 a.m. on December the 6th. Now there's Vincent Colman, who again was this very determined and brave man who was using this very telegraph key. You can actually see the key he was using at the moment he died at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in their explosion exhibit. and he's the one who sent out this warning. None of the original telegraph records have survived, but some people wrote down what they remembered were the messages right after. And so we have this 4 versions of the message he sent, sort of saying, munition ships on fire, is going to explode, stop all the trains. And then he kind of handed off in a message at the end using a railway telegrapher shorthand, saying, I guess this will be my last message, goodbye, boys. So, clearly a man who was staring death in the face. His body was recovered about 2 days later in the wreckage of the Richmond station. He'd been killed by the explosion, and his family kept for years his wallet. A lot of trains that were coming to Halifax, and even more important, and this is not widely appreciated, he alerted the entire Canadian government railway system that this horrible disaster was about to occur. So his message was heard by every station from Halifax to Truro. And then Truro quickly relayed it to Moncton and then relayed it to Ottawa. And so this whole system was kind of put on alert that a horrible thing was about to happen. And this is really important because otherwise the lines just would have gone dead. This has happened in other disasters. When the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, all the lines went dead, and other Japanese cities had no idea what happened. And it took a Japanese airplane to fly over Hiroshima to realize the whole city had been destroyed, and it was like half a day before help arrived. Coleman's message alerted the whole system that a horrible catastrophe was about to happen, and then the system responded very quickly. So that's Vincent Coleman's part in this saga. Now, a lesser-known character who's never had a heritage match, maybe he deserves one, is this guy named George Graham. He was the general manager of the Dominion Atlantic Railway for a long time, from 1911 till 1940. He was a fellow from actually Western Canada, but when he was posted to Kentville to run this, very important regional railway, he fell in love with Nova Scotia and its history. And so you can thank him for establishing the Grand Prairie Park, for building this hotel, for all kinds of upgrades to DAR service. And so he was really a driven and a visionary guy. And that morning, he was in Halifax in business, and railway managers traveled in the private railway car. So this was his car, the business car for the Dominion Atlantic, called the Nova Scotia. And so it was like not only a traveling office, it also had kitchens and bedrooms, and the manager and his staff and family could kind of travel independently, attached to a DAR train or in a special to conduct business. So the Nova Scotia business car was parked just outside, just between the Halifax North Street station and the Richmond yards where Vincent Coleman was, so it was actually quite close to the explosion. It was pounded by the blast, the air blast. It was far enough away, it wasn't swamped by the tsunami, but a number of the windows broke. George Graham was just sitting down to breakfast with his daughter, Helen Graham. They were being served by the railway steward, George Clark. When the whole railway carriage shook and windows blew in, Graham's daughter, Helen, kind of got quite a bad cut from the glass. Nobody knew any idea what had happened, but clearly something really terrible had happened. Graham sent his daughter sort of downtown to seek some medical attention and care of the steward, George Clark, they then made their way through the devastating streets of Halifax, moving south. Helen Graham was quite a determined young woman. She got minor treatment for a cut and then went to work as a volunteer for one of the hospitals all day long. Then George then set up north from his private railway car to see if he could summon help and to find out what had happened. And by the way, this railway car, the Nova Scotia, the business car that he was in, still exists. It's the only piece of Dominion Atlantic Railway rolling stock that was actually preserved, and it's now with the Upper Canada Railway Museum in Toronto. You can see it in their Roundhouse Museum right beside the CN Tower in downtown Toronto. They've done a really good job of storing it. So this railway car that sheltered the Graham family, and as we'll see, played a key role in early response, is actually still a surviving object. So Graham appears to have followed the tracks from where his car was parked to find a telegraph line that was working. And he quickly realized as he was walking around that something had just leveled most of the north end of the city, that all the telegraph lines he could see were down, and that much of the track was blocked by wreckage. And so he would have passed the crushed wreckage of the Richmond station where Coleman's body was lying, clearly no movement, nothing could be done there. And as he was rounding this corner, he encountered the number 10 train. It had been stopped at Fairview Station just before the blast. So it had all the windows on one side were broken in by the blast, but only minor injuries. And then they had proceeded sort of into the city, not knowing what had happened. And they arrived just as George Graham walked by them. And this train was immediately besieged by injured people, dragging themselves out of wrecked houses and pleading for help with relatives who were trapped in houses that were now starting to burn. So this number 10 train actually ends up playing a really important impromptu role as a rescue train because it's full of people. Half of them are soldiers. It's wartime, and they suddenly become this massive first aid post in North End Halifax. And people are ripping up sheets from the overnight sleeping berths and tablecloths from the dining car to tend to wounded, and also fan out across Richmond using rescue tools from the train to pry people out from collapsed houses. Now Graham keeps walking and then makes it to Fairview Station, where he finally finds a working telegraph in about a half hour. He recalled that he counted 15 bodies across the track as he was going. The explosion had not only devastated North End Halifax, it had killed 60 railway employees across the system, people working in yards and railway engines. But he arrived at Fairview Station to find the telegraph was working, but nobody knew what had happened or what should be done. Graham was a railway telegrapher. He started his job as a young man in an isolated western train station. He could pound out Morse code very quickly. And so he said, hand me the key, and sent a message right away to his railway in Kentville. And here's the message he sent, and he wrote it down right away. It's a very kind of powerful, incredibly succinct message about kind of what had to be done. And coming from the general manager of a railway, his word was law, and it instantly sort of ignited a frenzy of activity in Halifax. It's one of the most powerful outgoing messages next to Vince Conlin from the explosion. You'll often hear people saying, this is the message that was sent to Boston. Well, no, it wasn't. It was the message that was sent to Kentville by George Graham. So organized relief train sent word to Wolfville and Windsor, and round up doctors and nurses and all the cross supplies possible to obtain. No time to explain details, but casualties are enormous. So here's his message coming from this manager right at the scene of the destruction and arriving in Kentville. So here's a nice shot from the King's Historical Society of Kentville in World War I, the beautiful old Kentville railway station, the freight shed across. This is in February of 1915. There was a big recruiting drive in February and March of 1915 for the Highland Brigade, and there's some soldiers from Aldershot drawn up to welcome the big recruiting train. So as you might imagine, in this era, the Kentville station was like the center of so much. It was, the busiest place in town. It was the center of the most important business in town. It was a major employer. It was the crossroads of communication and transport and of business and commerce. Had a lovely restaurant that was well patronized. Even had a tennis court across the way. That was a big social part of Kentville life. It was a really hub of activity, and in wartime even more so, with the movement of troop trains back and forth to Aldershot, the movement of supplies across the railway. Was a really busy place, and this is where Graham's message arrived, which then sort of touched off a lightning bolt in multiple directions as people kind of responded to his plea to round up doctors, nurses, and supplies. So runners and telegraph delivery boys on bicycles and fanned across Kentville and north of Kentville to find the doctors, find the nurses, and get them to the station as quickly as possible. And assemble they did. One account I love of one nurse who just picked up her bag, put on her cap so quickly that she left her iron on her ironing board where she was ironing a blouse. And when she finally got back from Halifax a week later, she found a whole bird through her blouse. But she responded very quickly, as did multiple medical providers in Halifax. We don't have a complete list, and I'd love to see a complete list, but we know for certain that Dr. Joseph McGrath of the SAN responded. Dr. Henry Webster went down to the train station. Dr. Percy McGrath, who was a doctor, and his wife, who was a nurse, both responded. And apparently they wrote down their account. I haven't seen it. I'd love to. One historian kind of summarized how they sort of frantically were just throwing all the supplies from their doctor's office in boxes and bags, and then the two of them rushed to the station. Then Dr. Wilford P. Moore replied, and he was a country doctor when the messengers caught him just as he was coming back from his morning rounds and told him that he had to get to Halifax. And lots of other people, whose name I'd love to know, but we don't know, they all converged on the Kentville station. Now, Dr. Moore wrote down an account of what happened that day. It's an amazing account. The Halifax Relief Commission hired a historian, Archibald McMecken, to try to document the explosion. And you can see the Halifax Record Office letterhead. He wrote down this amazing 8-page description. It was published in a book by Graham Netson. Now, if you wanted to get a vivid first-person account of the explosion from a Kentville perspective, Moore's account is really amazing. I'll be drawing on it several times. But he kind of describes about to leave office in Kentville to make some calls in the morning. Then from the DA office in Kentville, I was asked to go on a special relief train and to ask nurses to go. Once I prepared as required, and then he kind of describes the kind of roundup of people and supplies. You can just imagine the frantic activity at the station as these folks converge, and as the railway has to build up a special unscheduled trains and hook together passenger and baggage trains to get this medical personnel to Halifax. This is what is happening in Halifax at the time. We don't have a picture of the train, but this picture of a sort of a winter train leaving from Halifax in 1915 from Chris Gertrude's collection gives you an idea of the probable makeup. I'd love to know what locomotive it was. I think it was probably, I remember, 32 or 33, which were the most biggest and powerful locomotives the DAR had in World War I, and they would have been hooked up to this train, hastily loaded up with Red Cross supplies and doctors and nurses. And so they had this train made up and loaded and ready to go just before noon with all the people aboard. And then they set off from Halifax, from Kentville to Halifax, but with stops to make on the way because Graham had said, alert Wolfville and Windsor because there's medical resources there right on the main line that the train could pick up. So this is a picture of a DAR train just before the war, about 1912, and gives you an idea of a DAR locomotive under speed and rushing through the countryside. The engineer apparently was Archibald Beach apparently was the DAR engineer, and Harry Taylor may have been the conductor, but I'd love to kind of confirm that. Conductors run the train, the engineer drives the engine. I'd love to know more about who was on that train and what it was made of, but we don't have any primary records of that. But I can just imagine it taking steam up. Apparently, Leach sort of later told that he made record time between the stations. They had long station stops to make in Wolfville and Windsor, and then at Windsor Junction. But in between those stations, apparently, he kind of blew the boards off, and kind of good time. So the first stop was Wolfville. Lovely shot from the Wolfville Historical Society of the station soon after it was built, about 1912. The station that's still there, the only station of the ones I'm mentioning that has survived, Monium, of the morning of December the 6th, as all these doctors and nurses are hastily arriving, waiting for this kind of relief train. It's a charming picture of it in sort of summertime, but also gives you a sense of what a busy place a wartime station was. I love this shot of the Wolfville station a year later on November the 11th, when people gathered to celebrate the end of the war. And a young woman from Wolfville with her kind of pony, which she was using to help sell victory bonds. Yeah. And I throw that one in just as an illustration of how central the railways were to the war effort. So waiting for the train in Wolfville were a whole bunch of doctors and nurses. Nurses Grace Andrews, C.A. Partridge, Alpha Bush, Jessie Parker, Georgina Miner, Greta Harris, and doctors J.J. Allen, doctors M.R. Elliott, and then Dr. George DeWitt, who's going to play an interesting role in this in a few minutes, because he was a doctor. He had a son who was a doctor who got into Halifax that morning on the morning train. And so he's arriving, waiting anxiously, along with his daughter, Nellie DeWitt. And they're going to go together into Halifax when this train arrives. So they board the train in Wolfville, along with apparently 3 professors from Acadia University who they felt they could be useful in some way. Professors Archibald Coit and Cutman, who was apparently the president of Acadia at that point, they got on the train as well to render what assistance they could. And then it was off from Wolfville. Oh, and here's Georgina Miner. She was one of the nurses from Wolfville who was in on that train. And as much as often as I mention doctors, nurses were really critical, especially with this kind of emergency care in response. So the nurses equaled the number of doctors on these trains, but we just don't know all their names. We do know Georgina Miner's name. And this nice picture of her, which I think Wendy Elliott for rounding up for me.
From Gasboro originally.
Ah, okay. So then the next stop was Windsor. And the DR main line at that point didn't go across the causeway, because the causeway wasn't built yet. It went across the railway and then went right down the main street of Windsor. And it was, so here you can see a DAR train, an eastbound train, Halifax bound, which is just pulling into the Windsor station here, much as our relief train would have done the early afternoon of December the 6th. This is I think, a Canada event in the 1920s. The streets wouldn't have been so busy, but you can just imagine the train going right through Windsor's main intersection, where the Windsor station was the center of so much in Windsor. Nice shot of the station shortly after it was built, about 1910. It was sort of right at the base of Port Edward Hill. You can see the old Windsor Ware textile mill in the background. This location is currently buried under the brand new 101 overpass, but that was once Windsor's station, which had a large station and a big freight station next to it. And so in Windsor, they picked up more medical personnel. Dr. Ernest Bissett and Dr. Clarence Morriff boarded in Windsor, plus more nurses and more medical supplies. And then on from Windsor, they went to Halifax. However, before you get to Halifax, there's a really important connection in Windsor Junction. Does everybody know where Windsor Junction is? It's not far from kind of Waverley, just outside of Halifax. And some really important things happen in Windsor Junction. This is the DAR line from the valley, which is curving to connect to the main line. Which was at that point called the Canadian Government Railway, but everybody still called it the Intercolonial. So Halifax connects to the main line here, and then it's just a few miles into Halifax. Here's a DAR train that you can see on one leg, and let's pretend that's our train from December the 6th pulling in. And just pulling in from Halifax is a really beat-up train with all these broken windows. This is train number 10, that train that had been in the north end of Halifax and had become this ad hoc first aid station. And a really interesting thing happened with train number 10. After George Graham had sent his message to Kentville, he saw the people on train number 10, and he said, "Is there anybody here who's a doctor?" And there was a doctor who was just arriving from Kentville, Dr. Avery DeWitt, who was an Army doctor from Aldershot, the Army base. And he had been going into Halifax for a meeting that morning, and then George Graham said, "There's a train full of injured and dying people that need your help. And you've got to get to ground zero where this train is waiting." And so Graham, they kind of took charge, flagged down a small switching locomotive that was in the yard in Fairview, and climbed aboard the blood-stained cab of this locomotive. The engineer had been killed by the explosion, and there was this shivering fireman, and Graham said, "Take this doctor into Richmond. His services are needed." And this kind of poor young fireman who he'd given his coat to an injured boy, then sort of took this doctor, beside the bloody seat where the engineer had been killed, took them into train number 10, and then Dr. DeWitt then went to work on all these injured people. And they were able to get the locomotive turned around, and then train number 10 started from Halifax to Truro. The logic being that it was too hard to get through the central Halifax and the north end to the hospitals in the south end, but it was better to take these injured people to Truro. This is in Windsor Junction, is where the Kentville train meets the Truro-bound train with all these broken windows packed car to car. There was 12 different cars on this, and it's just full of hundreds of injured people. And they say it's clear that they need help right away. So, Dr. DeWitt, George DeWitt from Wolfville, then boards this train to help. And he boards the end of the train, having no idea that his son, Avery DeWitt, is busy doing surgery at the front of the train. And as the train then moves off to Truro, and with Avery DeWitt doing surgery and emergency treatment from the end of the train, and George DeWitt doing surgery from the front of the train, and it's not to Truro. Until they get to Truro, they realize they're both on the same train, father and son, with Nellie DeWitt assisting her father as nurse, the only sort of trained medical people on this train. They do hundreds of treatments and surgery, including 2 full surgical operations on the train while it's moving to Truro. And what's even more sort of staggering is when they finally pull into Truro, they discover that the 2 DeWitt doctors and Nellie, the nurse, are the only medical personnel in Truro, because everybody in Truro had headed into Halifax. The Truro did exactly what Kentville did, was rounded up every doctor, nurse, sent them into Halifax, and here's this train full of 200 or 300 wounded people, and so then the DeWitts have to work all through the night in an improvised hospital in Truro, doing multiple surgeries, looking after this mass incident. Fortunately, country doctors from places like Shubenacadie and Upper Stewiacke converge on Truro to assist them as they work through the night. And these are really serious injuries. 10 of their patients died during the night. They were so badly injured that they couldn't be saved. So the DeWitts end up, making this major contribution in this really unexpected way. Yes, sir.
This train was coming in to Halifax.
Yes.
The windows are all blown out, everyone's cut up and so on. These 2 doctors are on the train, and now it's heading back to Truro.
Correct.
Where did they get their medical supplies? Because they wouldn't be on the train by...
No, the supplies was transferred from Kentville train to help them do some of the work they were going to do. I don't know how they divvied it up, but they do talk about when the DeWitts boarded, they were given some supplies that had been rounded up Kentville, Wolfville, and Windsor. That and all those improvised bandages people were ripping up from sleeping berths is kind of all they had to deal with. Actually, I think Dr. Avery describes what he had to do with his 2 surgeries, and it was kind of 1 scalpel from his bag and 1 pair of forceps, so that nothing. And so it was very rudimentary, but critically important surgery on the go. So already Kentville has made a difference by providing supplies and support to this Truro-bound train, and then our Kentville train then gets clearance to head into Halifax. The train then picks up, this is not a picture of the Kentville train arriving in Halifax, but it would have looked like this. This is a picture actually a couple of days after the explosion, and you can see a train entering the Richmond area, the area of total devastation. And they went as far as the tracks could take them into this hellish landscape of burning buildings and corpse-strewn streets until the train could not go any further. So they arrive about 3 p.m., 3 hours from here to Halifax, making 3 important stops along the way. It's a very good time. But then there's this sort of mystery, what do we do now? They're surrounded by all this rubble. They dispatched the doctors, nurses, and the supplies they could carry on foot from Richmond, heading south to see if they could find hospitals to help. And kind of what's interesting, they didn't actually have to walk that far. Once they sort of got past North Street, the streets were still open, and they were immediately spotted by, just imagine the landscape they're walking through. It's kind of just devastation. Dr. Moore talks about bodies were already piled 4 feet high on the sidewalk as people were pulling bodies from the rubble. People had shocking injuries. They kept meeting people who'd lost entire families but were still trying to help out. And then once they get to North Street, they encounter a fleet of cars. And by this time, the Halifax City Hall had a meeting just before noon on December the 6th. The mayor was away, but the deputy mayor convened a meeting. The police, the army, the harbor officials, and they organized really rapidly to form a series of committees. There was a committee to treat the injured, there was a committee to establish communication links, another one to do transport, one to look after the dead, and then one to round up supplies. And the Transportation Committee did an amazing job in rounding up every vehicle in Halifax. Every delivery wagon, every army truck, and every private vehicle. This is a car, a Halifax car in the winter of 1914. The first car on my street on Duncan Street, typical of the sort of Model Ts rigged up for winter that you would have in Halifax. And any private car was then seized by the police and the military, working together to say, you're now going to transport wounded and medical personnel. Remember my teacher, grade 6 in Halifax, she had an uncle who was a soldier in Halifax during the war, Mrs. Kenny, and she said, her uncle said, yeah, we pulled over one car, and we said, we need your car to move wounded. And he said, well, I'm sorry, it's a brand new car, and I don't want to get blood all over the sheets. So the soldiers picked him up, threw him out of the car, and then took his car, and when he got it back 3 days later, and it saved many lives, but it was covered in blood. But much to Dr. Moore's surprise, the drivers recognized who they are and said, listen, we've got to take it to City Hall, they'll figure out where you'd be most useful. So they're picked up from North Street, and then the doctors and nurses from Kentville are taken to Halifax City Hall, where they'd already kind of figured out which hospitals had survived the blast, which hospitals needed help, and how much help they needed. At this point, Halifax had 2 large hospitals, the good old Victoria General, and there was a brand new Army hospital called Hospitals, and then there were about 8 smaller hospitals. 2 of them had been destroyed by the explosion, but there were a variety of smaller hospitals, mostly attached to different units of the military. And the committee of City Hall quickly figured out which hospitals needed the most help, and then we're kind of sending doctors and nurses who were starting to converge in Halifax to where they were needed most. And most of the folks from Kentville were dispatched to the Kentville Hospital. Here's a picture of the Camp Hill Hospital shortly after it was built. We all know today is a much bigger building, but it was big by Halifax standards in 1917, right near the Willow Tree and the Halifax Commons. And it was a big modern hospital, but it was built as a kind of a complex hospital to help long-term recovery of soldiers who'd been sent from Europe, badly wounded to Halifax, and here's where they would get their therapy and time to recover. So it did not have an emergency room or heavy-duty surgical staff. It had kind of a bare-bones staff, but it didn't have very good facilities. And people quickly realized that the Victoria General was just overrun, and then thousands of people started to converge on the Camp Hill Hospital, and they needed help in a real big way. And that's why the doctors and nurses from Kentville were sent to Camp Hill Hospital. And here's an interesting newspaper photo of an army truck delivering wounded to the entrance of Camp Hill. And so Dr. Moore paints a vivid picture of what it was like when they arrived at Camp Hill Hospital. There were wounded people everywhere. The wards had instantly filled up, and then the gurneys had filled up in the hallways, and then the stretchers had filled up in the hallways. He said to get from one room to another, you basically were walking over injured people. And stepping across them. And then they improvised these operating theaters to do surgery after surgery after surgery. You spread blood. There were some people who died before we could get them. There's only so much we could do, but it was just one operation after another. Many, many eye injuries because people had been watching the explosion when the windows dove in, and there were thousands of eye injuries that day. Also really bad limb injuries and internal injuries, and they just worked all through the night. He kind of mentioned, in spite of the kind of grim circumstance, it was remarkably quiet. There was no panicking or people yelling. It was kind of a really well-organized grim response, a very sober triaging of who could be helped the most as these doctors, many of whom had ever worked together, were working with the nurses to do all these improvised surgeries. So that's what Dr. Moore and Dr. McGrath and his wife, Mrs. McGrath, were working as nurses, and the other folks from Kentville. They spent basically their whole night at Camp Hill Hospital dealing with this influx of injured people. We don't have a picture of the interior of Kentville Hospital. It's a picture of one of the temporary hospitals at St. Mary's College, near where the Kentville Superstore is today. But here's a picture of one of those improvised hospitals with a doctor at work with some injured children to give you an idea of kind of what it would have liked to have been like kind of the morning after in these kind of improvised medical facilities. Dr. Moore worked all night long, and he finally begged off sort of early in the morning. He had close family friends in Dartmouth, and he wanted to see how they were doing. And he managed to get across to Dartmouth on the ferry to see how they were doing. They were fine, although they'd lost one side of their house. And then he went back to Halifax. As soon as he checked in at City Hall, and they said, we need you to do some urgent care in the North End. Some people who are too badly injured to move, can you go up and look after them? So he then was taken by car to a demolished store in the North End where he did kind of some more infield surgery. And he stayed in Halifax for a couple of days. That's the response from Kentville being deployed, remarkably quickly to assist people after the explosion. And Kentville responded among the quickest, but they were not the first. Truro actually got the first train in. It arrived about noon the day of the explosion. And Truro is on the intercolonial main line. They already knew from Vincent Coleman's message that something terrible had happened, and they had started to mobilize even earlier than Kentville. And as I indicated, they rounded up every single doctor and nurse in Truro, sent them to Halifax, and their train arrived at noon. But so did a whole bunch of other trains that day. Moncton sent 4 trains the day of the explosion. The Moncton trains picked up people from Sackville and Amherst along the way. New Glasgow sent a train into Halifax the day of the explosion, picking up doctors and firefighters in Stellarton. And even Dixon St. John, New Brunswick, put a train on the rail at noon on December the 6th, and it arrived early in the morning of December the 7th, just before the snow started. So it was a remarkable rounding up of emergency medical response across the region. Dr. Alan Marvel has actually counted up the doctors who went to Halifax. 103 doctors from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. 103 doctors just from Nova Scotia went into Halifax. So Halifax, at this point in 1917, had 78 doctors, so they more than doubled the number of doctors within a few hours, thanks to this incredibly rapid railway response and dedicated humanitarian drive. So it's a really powerful response. And this is when sort of the medical surgical help was needed the most. When the Americans arrived 3 days later, it was too late for emergency medical surgery. The critical care was needed in those immediate hours after the explosion. And that's when these folks from across Nova Scotia, parts of New Brunswick, mobilized really, really quickly. It's kind of interesting, you never hear about these relief trains that came from towns of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And it was the first outside help. The Americans didn't arrive until December the 8th and the 10th. Their trains were delayed by a big snowstorm. And it was the local response from the Maritimes that arrived when it was needed most. And that's never, I don't think, really been properly recognized. And many of you will know that early in the morning of December the 7th, the day after the explosion, Halifax was hit by a major blizzard that buried the roads and the rails as far as Moncton, slowing train travel to a crawl on the day after the explosion. So hence the trains from places like Boston and New York and New Hampshire, it took them 2 to 3 days to get to Halifax. So that reply, thanks to really dedicated and disciplined work by people like Graham and all the doctors and nurses in Kentville, was done at perfect and exactly the right time. And I'm focusing on the events of December the 6th. There's a whole saga of the days that followed after the explosion. And, I must give the credit to the Americans. Although when they arrived, there's no more emergency medical care to be done, but there's all kinds of long-term recovery. And the Americans were very good at sticking around for months and then setting up agencies to work for years in terms of the housing and long-term care. So there was a good long-term commitment from the Americans once the immediate crisis was over. And all kinds of other things happened in Halifax. They had to find housing for people, they had to find coal supplies to keep people warm. They had to deal with the overabundance of help that came in afterwards, people sending stuff that Halifax didn't need. So there's a whole interesting story about that. If you ever want to get a good sense of the emergency response. A book published just 2 years ago by Joseph Scanlon called Catastrophe is a really good sort of detailed account of the sort of the mechanism of emergency response from the explosion, and has a great chapter on Kentville too. I will touch a bit about just how quickly the railways responded, though. This railways in Halifax, they had 60 people killed in the railway. The superintendent, the main man to run the railways, was badly injured and out of account, so his second in command took control. And then all these railway people, many of whom lost families. There were, just looking at the Dominion Atlantic Railway alone, they had a sort of an operation in Halifax. 3 DAR employees were killed in Halifax. And sadly, 4 DAR employees lost their families in Halifax. They were out on the rails, but their whole families were killed. So a lot of railway people were grieving and dealing with loss, but they pitched in to rebuild the railway remarkably quickly. This is a picture of the North Street Station, the main passenger station for Halifax. The roof partially collapsed during the explosion, but you can see this is about 3 days later, and they've almost got it all shoveled out. And they pulled down the old roof, and by January the 1st, they built a brand new roof for it. And even in its ruined state, it went back into service 3 days after the explosion. I mean, it's kind of astonishing. The rails have been buried in rubble. All these employees have been killed. Massive passenger cars have been destroyed. But they got the rails clear within 3 days, and then resumed their normal timetable of passenger movements from the North Street Station. And this is a picture taken December the 9th of one of the early trains leaving. And it must have been shocking to kind of, you would have to traverse the worst part of the devastation in Halifax before you left the city. And interestingly, when they resumed the schedule, the very first scheduled train to start operation is the DAR evening train to Kentville on December the 6th. So the DAR is in here kind of start to finish. And then on December the 10th, the whole normal winter schedule is all operating again. So it's really remarkable. The railway mobilized actually so many workers and equipment and cranes that they went on, once they cleared the tracks and got the stations working, they rebuilt all the wharves in Halifax so that the wartime shipping traffic could kind of continue. It's, as devastated as Halifax was, and this picture only gives you a glimpse. I mean, this is a ship that is smashed up here. There's another one in the distance that's half sunk. Shipping and convoy operations resumed 5 days after the explosion. So, this horrible accidental event only slowed up shipping out of Halifax for 5 days. And then they were kind of back in business as a busy wartime port. And the remarkable concentration of resources by the railway is really big kind of part of that. So coming to the kind of end of my talk, I do find it ironic and a little sad that when people talk about relief and help from the explosion, all they ever talk about is the American help. Folks from Boston, and that's what gets recognized every year with like the tree we send to Boston. Now here's a cartoon of Uncle Sam arriving with all the food and supplies, and a lot of that is deserved. The American commitment was impressive and it was long term, but it's also the Americans also made sure everybody knew that. The doctors and nurses that came up from places like Boston, New York, they brought reporters and PR agents with them who were very sort of made to the point that, America is rescuing Halifax. And which kind of understandable. They were investing a lot of resources into it. But they also spent a fair bit of time slagging Nova Scotia and Halifax, saying, we arrived and the city was chaos and nothing was being done and we had to bring order. And in fact, the city had organized very effectively to marshal its resources that first day of the explosion. And so there were some real drawbacks to some of that American assistance. And I think it's cast a long-term shadow for people to make people forget the remarkable local response in all these towns across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. If there was any justice, Halifax would send a Christmas tree to Kentville. So that's a glimpse of these really determined and brave people who set out from Kentville just before noon on December the 6th to help with the Halifax explosion. And if you kind of want to explore this story in more detail, this is an amazing book published by a guy named Graham Metzen in 1978. This is a copy my mom gave me when I was in high school. Madsen published, it's got a short introduction, and then it's actually period documents from the explosion, including all 8 pages of Dr. Moore's account of going in from Kentville. And including Archibald McMecken, who was the historian that the Relief Commission hired. He wrote a draft book that was never published. It's got a whole chapter on the railways. And it's a really great book. If you can find it, published in 1978, to give you a glimpse of the explosion. So that's a great source. The other is Joe Scanlon's book, just recently published 2 years ago, where he kind of distills some of the stuff that are mentioned in Madsen's book, and then gives it a sort of a big picture look at sort of disaster response, what went right in Halifax and what went wrong, sort of the show loading of the Americans, and he's got a whole chapter on Kentville and Truro and the work they did. So that's really kind of an important book, kind of published by an academic publisher. It's not been kind of widely produced there, but it's got some nice Valley stuff in it. And also Scanlon understands how railways and telegraphs worked and how the information spread. It's a really good perspective. Also, a couple of good articles were published in the Canadian Rail Magazine, which is the journal of the Canadian Railway Historical Society. Scanlon published a good article in 1997, and then a guy named Douglas N.R. Smith published one in '94 that dipped into a lot of the railway records, and those are good sources of it. I also should mention that Truro in 2017 published a nice little booklet about what Truro did. And they looked into to Truro's response in great detail, lists all the doctors and the nurses, the challenges that they faced, and what the Buicks did when they arrived in Truro. And also how Truro helped out when the Americans finally started passing through on December the 10th and 11th and 12th. So this little booklet by the Colchester Museum is kind of nicely done. A good thing for Kentville to do something similar maybe in the future. So that's my summary of this kind of dramatic role Kentville played in the worst man-made disaster in Canadian history. Thanks to a bunch of folks who provided images, so I could help you out there at some of the big institutions of the province. Plus, thank you, Chris and Tony Calkin, for some of your images. Louis Cabot, who found the only picture I've ever seen of George Graham. This guy who was this incredibly powerful, influential guy in the history of the Valley, and there's only this one photo Louis was able to find, and Wendy Elliott from directing me that photo of Georgina Minor. So there's our work at this period of history. And if you have any questions, I would be delighted to receive them.